And from the White House to the U.S. Supreme Court, let's bring in the Center Square's Andrew Rice to talk about some of the latest decisions that the justices are making concerning you and your rights. Welcome in, Andrew. It's good to see you. And a lot of activity expected in the weeks ahead. Still a lot of things that the Supreme Court has to handle, but also decide upon. But they did make some decisions today after going into conference last week with a slew of cases. They came out today with an orders list, and one in particular, a lot of people in the land of Lincoln looking at, and that's the Schoenthal case. Tell us what this case is about and what the U.S. Supreme Court decided today.
Right. Well, it's great to be here with you, Greg. The Supreme Court decided after multiple different relists here, decided to ultimately deny Schoenthal versus Rowell, a case out of Illinois on the state's ban of firearms, users holding firearms, possessing firearms in public transportation. So this is your public buses, this is your metros, your subways, anything that is even partly funded by those public funds. So this has been a ban in Illinois for gun users. They cannot have loaded firearms on these areas, and they cite laws restricting. The state cites laws restricting guns from being in, quote, sensitive places. That's an area like a courtroom or a school or other sensitive areas like that. They say that these sensitive areas, public transport in those sensitive areas are pretty much the same. But challengers came into some gun rights advocates, several came in to challenge this restriction and saying, these are very open and public places where dangerous things can occur. And it would maybe be necessary to have a firearm, a loaded firearm, to be able to respond in an emergency incident if something dangerous happens on a bus or other public transportation vehicles. But ultimately, like I said, the Supreme Court denied hearing that case. And it'll be interesting to see as they move forward, because the court is looking at a lot of different areas of gun laws, particularly with sensitive cases and some other decisions. So it'll be interesting how those other decisions maybe affect this law in Illinois moving
and
forward.
A lot of the other things they're going to be looking at are prohibitions of individuals being able to own and possess certain types of semi-automatic firearms. Andrew, did the Supreme Court give any indication, or sometimes they might just put out cert denied, and cert is that request from the litigants to say, hey, Supreme Court, please take our case, right? What did they say, if anything, other than just the denial in this particular case out of Illinois?
Right. That's a great question, Greg. They pretty much flat out denied it. This was a pretty much plain and simple cert denial from the Supreme Court. It was listed among many other petitions that were requested at the court, but they pretty much the justices on the court straight up denied this case.
Now, I know in a previous case about Illinois' gun ban, for instance, when it was on preliminary grounds, and again, you've got kind of two tracks here. When we're talking about litigation that can make it up to the U.S. Supreme Court on the preliminary grounds, not on the merits, but on the preliminary grounds, a gun ban challenge did get all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they did deny that, but they did give there's like a 3 or 4 page response as to why they're denying that particular case. So it is kind of fascinating to see where the Supreme Court makes a little bit more of a telling as to why they're denying a case versus them just putting it in a list of dozens of others that just says cert denied. So Andrew, obviously, I mean, this is a fascinating case because you had a district court that had this case, and the district judge sided with the plaintiffs 2 years ago, saying, yes, the law is unconstitutional, but only for these 4 plaintiffs. And in that district court, the judge had to bring in the state that was trying to defend the law to chastise them in open court because they had said after the judge made that ruling, several people were shot and killed on Chicago's CTA on the Red Line. And the judge there said, hey, you can't make those kind of connections. My ruling has nothing to do with somebody who doesn't have a FOID card or a concealed carry license and shoots somebody. So it was interesting to hear and see that. And then when it got to the appeals court sided with the state, reversing the lower court's decision there. That kind of difference, right? You've got the circuit judge saying one thing, but the appeals court saying another. this issue clearly is not resolved.
Yeah, certainly. And it's very interesting that the court didn't pick something like this up, because they do tend to like to pick up cases where there is a circuit split in the lower courts. So just like you mentioned, the district court and that appeals court, they issued very vastly different rulings in this case. So it is very, very interesting that the court would deny this case, and especially deny it without having any kind of explanation, like I said previously.
Yeah, and again, fascinating to see this, and a lot of people in Illinois in particular, and quite frankly, Second Amendment, concentrated individuals across the country. They're very interested in these types of cases, and this one in particular. I guess we'll just have to see what happens next and what the plaintiffs are going to be doing about this. We do have requests for comments from the plaintiff's attorney, and hopefully we'll be able to share that with the Center Square audience. But Andrew, we have a slew of other cases concerning Second Amendment rights that the U.S. Supreme Court really hasn't made a decision one way or the other quite yet, and several of them are from Illinois and other states. What happens then if they have this in conference on Friday, but they don't really tell you what they're doing Monday? That gets just relisted, and they have to talk about it again, and people have to continue to wait?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that is really the case here. Although there's a lot of continuing to wait. There are, I will mention, some high profile other Second Amendment cases. There was previously heard arguments in a case somewhat similar to what we're seeing in Illinois out of Hawaii about the quote vampire rule, where concealed carry permit owners cannot come into a public business or a beach or something like that, these public lands, without permission from the owner of that area. So there's a chance that the kind of wording that's used in that ultimate decision that the court will release, we're looking at June, could influence how laws in Illinois are determined. That could really have a very significant influence on specifically the Second Amendment case and this issue. Looking ahead, we also have lots of different issues, particularly looking at immigration moving forward. On April 22nd, the court's expected to hear a big case, Bondi versus Lau. This is going to be whether temporary residents, lawful residents, but temporary lawful residents in the United States who commit crimes can be issued on probation, and how they can be adjudicated when a lawful permanent resident commits a crime here in the United States. It's based on a very significant criminal conviction of a Chinese immigrant who was convicted in a trademark issue. And so it'll be really interesting to see how the court looks at that. But then even later in the month, we're looking at more immigration, talking about Haitian and Syrian nationals and their temporary protected status. So a lot of nationals from Haiti and Syria are granted temporary protected status in the United States. This is given to them because they're fleeing either natural disaster, war, or famine, or something like that. But the Trump administration is looking to end that temporary protected status for these immigrants, because they say they are not able to properly process a lot of these immigrants that come in and that are seeking these kind of protections. And that leads to issues later down the line. But these immigrants, the lawyers for these immigrants are saying they deserve these protections, and that Haiti and Syria are still not safe places, especially considering U.S. conflict in Iran for Syria, that Haiti and Syria are not safe places for immigrants to be deported back to.
It's clearly some major decisions we're going to find out later on this summer, and a lot of discussions going to be had in oral arguments. Andrew, you've talked about in the past some of the other stories that you've written about concerning what they've already heard. If you could just, you touched on some of the major immigration issues. What are some of the big themes you think we're going to find out this summer as to what the U.S. Supreme Court's going to say? This is the law of the land, this is not the law of the land, or are we going to get some clarity on this stuff?
There's so much. Of course, there's some immigration. We heard, obviously, last week, the court heard birthright citizenship. We're going to hear some big decisions on where they side on that Trump's executive order for birthright citizenship. And we also can't forget earlier, a really big case that we're looking at is the transgender athletes participating in school sports. That's going to be a huge case coming out, likely in the summer, that we'll hear more about. And then, like I said, some Second Amendment cases in Hawaii, a drug ban on the Second Amendment out of Texas, whether users that consume drugs can be banned. And then also, we can't forget, with the midterms coming up, there is a significant redistricting case coming out of Louisiana about some congressional districts that could really change the way, at least in Louisiana, districts are rounded up for the midterm elections.
And then also they had a bit of a conversation about mail-in balloting in another case. So yeah, there's a lot that's going to happen with the U.S. Supreme Court coming up. But one thing, Andrew, obviously the Supreme Court kind of moves at its own pace, right? You don't know which ruling they're going to put out when until we get to probably the last day they're supposed to put out rulings, and you can kind of cross-reference and say, well, they've released these, but they haven't released these. But what can you tell us about those oral arguments and how instructive are those oral arguments into what the Supreme Court justices are thinking or which way they are leaning? Have you talked to some experts that kind of do that type of prognostication?
Yes, I speak to experts. I feel like I speak to experts all the time after these oral arguments that, they're trying to figure out that kind of split, what kind of decisions we're looking at, whether it's all the way from a, 5-4 decision all the way to a unanimous decision, 9-0 decision. And we see that kind of thing all the time. I think the most recent example of this is when we saw some serious skepticism from Chief Justice John Roberts, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, in last Wednesday's arguments on birthright citizenship. He was really grilling into John Sauer, President Trump's, the Solicitor General, and who was representing President Trump in this significant birthright citizenship argument. And he was really grilling into, in some of his questioning, about not really believing the administration's arguments that birthright citizenship can be taken away, and really seeming to side in that kind of questioning. Ultimately, though, these are just a bunch of questions, and so it can be hard to fully determine, but it does lean into the kind of language that these justices use. And there are some switch justices that you got to keep an eye on. In some of these kinds of issues, Roberts certainly being one of them, but also Justice Amy Coney Barrett, Brett Kavanaugh, and Justice Gorsuch. They can kind of go back and forth on some of these issues. They're not always going to side with the conservative Trump administration, but they also might not always side with the liberal justices and those appointed by Democrats. So it is really interesting to try to read the tea leaves, but it's not 100% foolproof for sure.
Yeah, not 100% foolproof, and that's why a lot of times you just got to wait until they release those orders, and that's what Andrew is anxiously anticipating. And you can keep up with his work and all of the team's work at thecentersquare.com. Andrew, thanks for taking time.